And we're live. Friends from around the world, welcome to the Great Debate. Not a debate where both sides work to defeat one another, rather where both sides work to find common ground on the most important issues of our time. That's what makes this debate great. Today, a new conflict. We are going to discuss the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Normally we focus on Israel-Palestine, but the point of the Great Debate is to bring people from opposing sides together to aid in the reconciliation process. And this is a conflict that in recent months has reawoken. There has been violence, there has been bloodshed. It is our duty to contribute what we can to this conflict. Those joining us for the first time, and I see that there are many of you, it's great to have you here. Just a few things to keep in mind. First of all, subscribe if you like what we do. We do this every week. It seems like there's a lot of interest in this conflict, so we'll probably host a debate like this at least once a month. If you know somebody who you think would be interested in joining for one of these debates, please reach out to me. You can find my contact information in the description. The comment section is for lively discussion. Keep it civil, keep it respectful. Before writing something, ask yourself, does this contribute to the conversation, or is it just unnecessarily inflammatory? Try to make your words create positive contribution. After this 1 hour to 1.5 hour discussion, we're going to move over to Discord. Discord is a platform. I won't explain too much about it, but we do an after party there where guests can come on with our two debaters, ask questions, share ideas, and continue the conversation. It's a conversation for all the people. Everybody is welcome. You can find also Discord in the description, and maybe if one of our Discord community members is here, throw that in the chat, please, so people can join. Without further ado, it's a great honor to bring on, oh yeah, we have a Patreon too, and I need to give a shout out to Trivium Energy Pty Ltd, which is our only visionary member. They donate to us every month. Yes, it's an energy company, so shout out to them, and if you like what we do, please support us on Patreon. That allows us to continue to do more of this amazing content. Without further ado, my two guests. To my top left, Fariz Huseynov is a professor of finance at North Dakota State University. He teaches courses in corporate finance, investments, and international finance. His research focuses on empirical corporate finance and tax avoidance. He is also the faculty fellow for the Chali Institute for Global Innovation and Growth, where he studies post-war economic and financial development policies. Fariz, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you.
And to my top right, Rich Èlmoyan is a geopolitical analyst based out of Los Angeles, California, specializing in post-Soviet developments in the Caucasus region, specifically the geopolitical features of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. He combined 6 years of institutional and independent research and is a former member of the Armenia National Basketball team in 2015 and 2016. Rich, it's a pleasure to have you here as well. So before we get started, we're going to do something a little bit different today. So I want to explain how this debate came to be. A young man by the name of Daniel Edelstein reached out to me asking me if we want to do a debate on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I said, of course I do. He found two guests. He found Rich and Fariz. Daniel also has written 2 articles on the conflict. So me and him decided that it makes sense for him to co-moderate today because he's much better informed about the conflict than I am. As you all know, this show is not about me. It is about the conversation, and somebody with knowledge on the conflict would be better equipped to deal with this than myself. So I'm going to bring Daniel on. Daniel, it's great to have you here.
Hey.
I'm still going to be here. I'm going to take myself off the screen, but if you all need me, I will be close by. Maybe I'll come by to do a little outro. Maybe I'll chime in once in a while, but Daniel, feel free to take it from here. Enjoy, friends. May it be a meaningful and productive conversation.
Awesome. All right. First of all, thank you guys for coming on. We all know how some of the discourse around this could be social media and things of that nature. So I really felt you two are both good faith actors really wanting to further a conversation on this. Just first of all, is there an echo in the background when I'm talking now? Or you guys hear me fine?
Now I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So there's going to be hopefully 5 parts to this conversation. I'm sure you guys could definitely bounce off each other within that parameter. But the first thing I just wanted to discuss is, what made you guys feel compelled to do something like this and go on this live stream in this video? For Israel, we can start with you.
Oh, you start with me. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this event, and I thank Rich for joining this conversation. And thanks to the audience for attending. The audience is lucky to hear from both sides of the conflict, which in many cases this doesn't happen. So I have a genuine interest in participating in these discussions. I simply wanted to share Azerbaijan's side of the story in a constructive manner. I think both nations can and should show that we're capable of coexisting peacefully. We need to build constructive dialogue between various groups of the society. I consider this dialogue as part of that. As a scholar, I'm also interested in learning how economic factors can contribute to the peaceful recovery. So research shows that they are significant at reducing tensions, but I need to see that in this conflict as well. So this will be given an opportunity for that. Also, I'm willing to listen to people on the other side of the conflict, people like Rich. So to understand how we can avoid toxic narratives and discuss the issues that separate us with the goal of resolving them and bringing peace to the region. That's it. Oh. Rich is mute, I think.
Rich, are you on mute? Rich, you there?
Interesting. We seem to have lost Rich. That was working fine before. I would maybe check your settings, your audio settings on the. No.
Well, I muted my own thing before. That's just for me. Right?
We were hearing him up until now. Hold on, let's see. Edit mic settings. Huh.
What about now?
Oh yeah, now it's good.
All right. Back to scheduled programming. Thank you everyone for joining the discussion. I'd like to make it clear that these discussions are important. The dialogue from the very beginning is important. And I was interested in this based off of the dialogue that's needed, given that time is a negative variable. Over time, this issue has further exacerbated. In contrast to the 90s, we're at a much more severe place in terms of relations. And I am interested in the geopolitical factors that further exacerbate this issue. May it be Russia, may it be Turkey, may it be Israel or Iran. We've all heard these actors in the region focused on the Caucasus, showing much more interest in the Caucasus. And therefore, I would like to provide my time to open dialogue and converse and learn the Azerbaijani side, given that it's very important to understand the ideology and to begin dialogue. Thank you.
All right, great. All right, so that just moves on to the second aspect, which is originally Adar was supposed to give a summation that I wrote him about the general conflict, but we figured it would be more time efficient and it would just utilize time better for you guys to do so within your own narrative. So that opens to the second part, which is if you could explain the conflict according to your own let's say national narrative, respectively. So we'll go again for Fariz. You could start, and then we'll go to Rich.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I guess there's a lot of chains in the events that we can focus on, but I would go back to the fall of 1987 when the Karabakh movement was formed in Soviet Armenia, with the aim of achieving Miatsum, which is the unification of Nagorno-Karabakh and Nakhchivan with the Armenian SSR. So this was at the time of Soviet Union. So these claims started clashes between villages and towns in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was part of Azerbaijan SSR, and in Armenia, parts of Armenia, Kafan, and some other regions. And towards the end of 1987 and early 1988, first group of Azerbaijanis had to flee Armenia, and that's where the clashes started, tension started rising up. And in February 1988, Armenian deputies of Nagorno-Karabakh voted for unification, which was not approved by the Soviet administration. So it's a self-declared unification. And if we identify the causes of the conflict, in my mind, there were two causes, two major points. One was socioeconomic, which kind of disappeared later, and one was ethno-demographic. So the socioeconomic causes are, when Armenian side argued that in the fall of 1987, that Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians have worse living conditions than Armenians in Armenia. So they thought this as a reason to claim that, you know, Armenians would live better. They would be better off if they lived in Armenia. This was not true in a way that, in fact, Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians and people in Nagorno-Karabakh, so Azerbaijanis and Azerbaijanians and Armenians, lived in better conditions than most of the Azerbaijanis or other ethnic groups in the rest of Azerbaijan, in comparable areas. So Soviet government in 1988 decided to allocate extra spending to meet their needs. And however, that was not the main point of Armenians. So essentially, this extra spending, that extra spending wouldn't alleviate their concerns, their issues, or their goals. So they said, no matter what, they wanted unification. So that tells me that the socioeconomic argument originally was just a pretext. Also, there was ethno-demographic causes. So during 19th and 20th century, the ethno-demographic structure of the region was changed a lot of times, artificially in several times, as a result of wars between Russia and Ottoman, let's say, or Russia and Iranian government, Qajar government, and so forth. So Azerbaijanis considered these changes organized with the aim of populating the area with Armenians. Regardless of the causes, though, the idea is that Azerbaijanis' view is that Armenians had always wanted to grab these lands from Azerbaijan. So take this away and add to Armenia. And perhaps they thought the late 80s were the best time for that because Soviets wouldn't be able to cope with that or essentially satisfy the demands of both sides. In the fall of 1987, so when we see the first Azerbaijanis started moving out of Armenia, the clashes started to spill over the other regions. And essentially, Azerbaijani side, in my mind, kind of trusted the Soviet leadership a little bit more, but Armenian side were more focused on taking away this land, so nothing would satisfy them. And then in 1991, they start taking over the essentially regions of Azerbaijan, and then 1992, then in Nagorno-Karabakh, part of Azerbaijan, and then 1992, Lachen and Kalbajar are invaded. So then we see that Armenian forces essentially invading Azerbaijan's lands, and in 1992, these lands were, these territories were internationally recognized territories of Azerbaijan. So UN's Security Council adopted 4 resolutions and says, look, this occupation by Armenian forces cannot continue. So they have to vacate, they have to leave these lands. These resolutions essentially said that Armenian forces have to leave Azerbaijan's international recognized territories. The problem was that they were not enforced as much, and war was going on again. And with the, I guess, with the foreign help, Armenia was stronger in the war, and essentially by the time we reached May 1994, when the Russia brokered a ceasefire agreement, roughly 20% of Azerbaijani land territories, including Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 districts surrounding that Nagorno-Karabakh, were invaded. There was no peace agreement. One side lost in devastation, the other side won, and they just kept occupation. going on. And then during these 90s and 2000s, many efforts, and I'm not going to go into details of those right now, but many efforts by Minsk Group, who was co-chaired by Russia, France, and US, didn't reach any agreement. They although after several major initiatives in 2006-2007 period, both sides agreed to the Madrid principles, which said the Armenians must leave the surrounding 7 districts, open up the relations, people come back, all the refugees come back, and there's some interim period status, and then the future status will be discussed later and decided later. But obviously it was a little bit better for Armenia, but Armenia kept the occupation ongoing, and Minsk Group unfortunately did not have much enforcement power. So neither their governments enforced Armenia to implement these principles, which essentially meant those 7 districts should have come back to Azerbaijan. But Armenia insisted on independence. So that's where the gap is, that they first obviously in 1987 started as a unification, but then it turned out to be independence of the Nagorno-Karabakh. But as I said, these 3 major countries did not exert enough pressure on Armenia to implement the elements of phased approach, which all these 3 agreed to the phased approach. But essentially, until 2018, when Mr. Pashinyan came to power, maybe there was a hope that, although that was fading away, but several statements and actions taken by Mr. Pashinyan essentially signaled that Armenian side is not willing to return these 7 districts, even 7 districts surrounding the Nagorno-Karabakh. Even in October 2018, U.S. Ambassador to Armenia, Richard Mills, said that, well, Armenian side adamantly opposed to the return of occupied territories as part of a negotiation settlement. So, unfortunately, all these peace negotiations during this time period kind of didn't reach any conclusion because there was no enforcement. And in March 2019, Armenia's Minister of Defense, David Tonian, declared a new offensive, new war for new territories. Now, I know it's a military narrative, but still, it sends a signal. I think in Khankendi in 2019, when Mr. Pashinyan said that Karabakh is Armenia, period, that just tells everyone that the peace negotiations is kind of off the table. And in 2020, again, Armenian side denounced the Madrid principles, which were the core of the peace negotiations. So effectively, these negotiations ended, and in July 2020, Armenian forces attacked Tovuz region, threatening Azerbaijan's major economic, not only Azerbaijan's, but regions and West's major economic projects in the region. So that basically, in my mind, shut down the peaceful resolution of the conflict. So, and when we come to August September period, it appeared that of 2020, it appeared that the war is going to happen in a way that tensions are so high, and any small clash would flare up, and that's what happened. And I think Azerbaijani side thinks that all these peace negotiations were just delaying the process, delaying tactics, and not seriously solving the problem. And I think that's sad, because that lost people's trust in peace in discussions. I think that's sad because so many people had to die. And at the end of the war, the liberated territories by Azerbaijani armed forces were supposed to be given back as one of the principles of these peace negotiations. So I think the idea is that all the bloodshed could have been avoided if peaceful negotiation, those principles were implemented. So that's my brief of the all 30 years of conflict, I think, as much as I could do.
All right, great, Rich. You wanna bounce off that? And yeah.
So the Armenian experience comes from the 1920s, 1930s. That's what they would mention, right? Already we're seeing a difference in the understanding that, let's say, the Azerbaijani side may be viewing this from the 1980s. Personally, I would, for the sake of time, I would like to start from the 1980s as well. But I think it's imperative to note that the Armenian side believes that the 1920s is also a big significant part of this, given that there was an Azerbaijani-Armenian war before the Soviet accession. With that being said, the Stalin era of borders and jurisdictions appointed to Azerbaijan of Nakhichevan and Nagorno-Karabakh. At the time, according to Soviet leadership, it made sense, though it was problematic on the long run. And this isn't the only area that had this issue. Of course, we saw with South Ossetia as well. But this issue comes around that Nagorno-Karabakh had a cultural identity connected to the Armenians. And this comes through the many times that Nagorno-Karabakh has aimed to reunify with Armenia throughout the 20th century. This can be seen in the 60s. It was more prominently done in the 80s. Of course, it was also in the 30s, but more prominently done in the 80s. And as far as mentioned, that was the area that was the time of Miatsum, which in Armenian means reunite in a sense, or unite. And the Armenian idea here is the reunification at looser autonomy, looser policies for autonomy. Meaning that when Gorbachev arrived in the 80s, it was a much different Soviet Union than Stalin era, much different. And you're starting to notice that the dominant national areas in the Caucasus specifically were going through their own clashes in which pogroms occurred in various cities. And the Armenian side finds these pogroms as the foundation of existential threat. And I think it's very important to mention, and this is a great watch for those who want an introduction on Armenian political theory by Girard Libaridian. He mentions that the Armenian political theory is connected to the Armenian genocide, which is an existential threat of its own that it experiences on the west side. However, one would say, okay, now Azerbaijan is a separate state. Why does this ideology also fall under that matter when the pogroms experience? Well, it's because Armenians would see Azerbaijanis as kinship to Turks. And they believe that, based off of the horrific memories of the Armenian genocide, that it could continue at some point given the relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan. This is just simply explaining the, constantly evolving mentality of what may be seen from the Armenian side. Now, understanding these pogroms, it was gruesome. People died, people injured, and eventually this led to the escalation of Black January as well. Now, moving to 1991, 1990, all countries were looking towards independence. Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then you also have Artsakh, but Nagorno-Karabakh in this case, which can go either way, similar to how Fariz mentioned Khankendi. In Armenia would be Stepanakert. So just for the sake of terminology. Now, when we see the independence coming up and looking for independence, for self-determination for the Armenian people, this is based off of the existential threat that they feel that they are not secure if once the Soviet Union collapses, they don't feel secure living under the Azerbaijani rule. Their immediate point would be, well, the pogroms. It showed exactly what could happen with high levels of nationalism. And I think it's important to mention that during the Soviet Union, nationalism was suppressed, religion was suppressed. So the basic issues that we have that would later come in the 1990s was becoming stronger. 1992 to 1994, in the independent era of both Armenia and Azerbaijan, they get into a conflict of war. It's important to mention also that one side sees this as a territory concept, the other side sees this as an existential threat, and therefore they require a buffer zone, which is like you mentioned, Kelbajar and Armenian Karabakh, as well as the Lachin district and Armenian Berzot. And therefore, it comes to a point where the Armenians occupy the 7 districts nearby, or control, or, if you're extreme Armenian, you mentioned liberate. But, the concept here is that Nagorno-Karabakh in itself had no direct connection to the Armenian borders. And that was the big conflict that we had from the Stalin era that came through. Given that the borders did not connect, Armenia needed a buffer in order to feel the security it so needs. Given that its borders are landlocked, Armenia in itself has that existential threat of Turkey on one side that was never acknowledged, right? And by the time of 1994, it was really not incorporated as Armenian foreign policy, which came later on when Turkey connected the bilateral relations with Armenia based off of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which later Armenia sets the Armenian genocide as a precondition as well. So how did we get to this level of the conflict, right? Well, in 1994, just like we mentioned, there was a ceasefire, but the ceasefire had no clear path with time, and that's why I mentioned time is a negative variable here. Given that the negotiations seem to not be going anywhere. There was a 1997, 1998 time. We were closer to getting to that. However, that did not continue with, the first presidential administration from Armenia having to getting ousted in a sense. Now, the Armenian transition from the Soviet Union to an independent state, that is where we need to understand what Armenia was going through. I mean, just like Azerbaijan, going from a socialist country to a capitalist one, the transition's not easy, especially with the war rebuild mode that you have to go into. So Armenia starts tying its relationships to CSTO, a stronger bilateral relationship with Russia. Azerbaijan, on the other hand, goes through something that Fariz can probably talk about more, an economic rejuvenation through its oil. And you start noticing that in the 2000s, the rhetoric changes. The rhetoric changes on both sides, maybe hinting towards nationalism in a post-colonial sense. And this is where we start seeing the Azerbaijani rhetoric, if seen by the Armenians, become much more hostile, which to an extent, there's some level of understanding given that time, again, is a negative variable. And as time goes and negotiations seem unsuccessful, the issue is only getting exacerbated. While the Armenian side believes that that security buffer zone is in its favor, given that the status quo since 1994 has not necessarily pushed Armenia to fully show, forward progression in the negotiations. Now, with that being said, the 2000s period experiences its hostilities in rhetoric, and in 2010s it continues. But I would like to remind that one of the key problems that the Armenians will now pinpoint today is the gruesome activity between the military personnel that is awful to see in its first place, based off of just humanity. And we want to understand why we got to this level. And some might say that, Ilham Aliyev's outward projection of what he thinks Armenians should be seen as is a negative concept. That's not to say that Azerbaijanis have a purpose through, in terms of negotiations moving forward. But that is also, just the simple rhetoric in terms of what we're hearing from Azerbaijan is very hostile. So by the time we get to 2016, the April war happens, 4 days. Turkey's not as involved. Israel is not involved at that time. 2020 changes, right? We see Turkey involved. We see it from the skirmishes in July between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Armenian side would argue that Azerbaijan posed this problem, given that or provocation, given that Armenia had no real incentive to push Azerbaijan to act. That is the general idea in Armenia as well, like I mentioned. And, when it comes to after July, you see Turkey much more engaged. You see Nakhchivan having exercises between Turkey and Azerbaijan, which is a exclave, not part of Azerbaijan proper, but connected to Turkey through a small border of its own. So you have that connection there from Turkey to grow, as well as the Israeli drones that is new age warfare and completely new. The rest of the world wanted to see what kind of drones these were. So in 2020, when we came to see what the difference was between the 1990s and the and the 2020, I should say, is the actors that increased their role. Meaning that the OSCE Minsk Group in 1994 that was made for the peaceful negotiations co-chaired by the Russians, the French, and the Americans, that was the Americans were disengaged starting, I want to say, their foreign policy in the Middle East. The French were not necessarily engaged, but at the same time listening to the conversations, while Russians maintained the main role of mediator here. So in 2020, when you see Turkey engaged and France looking to be engaged, but the Americans very disengaged, this provided an opportunity for Turkey to increase its role of influence and to hear what's happening right next door. And as we know, the expansionist foreign policy that we've seen Erdogan demonstrate, this was not too far from reality, given the Far East Mediterranean tensions as well. Now, you're probably hearing that I'm mentioning various factors here, and that's different names. That's because this conflict goes much more deep. Oftentimes, many people would try to explain it as a Kosovo-Serbia situation, but I would argue that the location matters much more than the issue in itself, given that the Caucasus has the Soviet history, while the Kosovo-Serbia issue is a little different with the Yugoslavian background. So to conclude on my perspective, what I see right now is a very similar situation post-1994, where we have an agreement, and it has at least one context here, right? It has a time frame. It says 5 years. However, it still does not answer a lot of the questions. For example, the IDPs out of this current war, the IDPs out of the last war in the 1990s, both Armenians had to flee Azerbaijan. Azerbaijanis had to flee as a result of the Armenian-controlled areas. So those are not necessarily mentioned concretely. Yes, they are mentioned that at some point Nagorno-Karabakh will have the return of the refugees that had fled, but it still has no concrete details in terms of what the future holds. And I think that is where this can be very dangerous, as well as the rhetoric that comes out of this war, given that I still am not confident in the Ilham Aliyev administration in terms of showing connection in the future of normalizing this within the next 30 years, because normalizing this issue in 5 years, I think, is very naive. It will take at least 20 to 30 years to truly go back to what we can, given that it's much easier to break something than to fix it. So thank you for your time. Sorry, Dan, you're on mute. I apologize.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so we could continue the bilateral discussion, but I just Rich wanted to provide some supplementary commentary and then also ask you something with regards to what you just said. So first of all,
I would like to respond to some of the comments, but after your question.
Sure. So when we go, so then after Rich responds, we'll go to you, and then you'll respond to him, and then we'll go to the next phase of the discussion. All right. So first of all, just as an aside, with you mentioned the difference with Kosovo. So yes, many people superficially will notice nominal parallels, but there's several factors there, which I think are just what you said, why it's different. There's also all the State Departments and essentially pundits and commentaries and scholars who have always consistently maintained that Kosovo is the exception and not the norm. That was not a precedent, because generally the norm of international law is.
I think we lost Daniel.
You hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, you're back.
All right. So yeah, usually that's the norm, and then there's also a separate issue of self-determination, that internal self-determination that coexists with this competing.
Can I interject?
So, Daniel,
Sure.
it seems like we're having some connection issues on your
I
end.
keep it brief, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, keep it brief, just because the internet's not playing in your favor.
So
yeah.
I didn't want to go back to 1920s, but I think since Rich did, I could just a brief comment on that. I think in 1918 there were three Caucasian republics, right? They became independent after the collapse of Russian Empire. And immediately, obviously, Armenia put forward territorial claims to Azerbaijan regions. Karabakh, Nakhchivan, and Zangezur at that time was part of Azerbaijan. The Karabakh and Zangezur were administered by Azerbaijani general governor, and the Karabakh Armenians agreed to submit to provisional Azerbaijani rule. Now, in 1921 and 23 period, I think it's easy to blame Stalin, but because he's got this evil leader kind of a PR. I think the idea is that in 1921 and 23, Stalin did not have much authority, sole authority, and the committee that made the decision to keep Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan. Stalin didn't have a voting power in that case, in that committee. So I think it's obviously, Armenians can build upon the Stalin and then blame Stalin, but that's not right. And essentially in 4th of July and 5th of July, I believe, 1921, the decision was that to retain, Astavit in Russian, the mountainous part of Karabakh in Azerbaijan, and that's official. So I think if we are basing on that, that's still not right, and that's not correct. And that during during the Soviet Union period, Nagorno-Karabakh and these 7 regions were part of Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic. And according to Soviet Constitution, when all these countries, 15 republics, maybe one or few less, in 1991 agreed to separate their ways according to Belovezh Accords, where they seceded from Soviet Union based on the Soviet Union Constitution, which essentially said only the republics can separate. 15 republics can essentially separate their ways from Soviet Union. So I think that's where there's a gap of understanding. You're right. Then going back to the pogroms, and yes, Sumgait pogroms essentially were investigated by Soviet authorities, and people who were criminals, who were responsible, were brought to justice. But we need to also understand that it's not the only one side. It's not the only one event in this sequence of events. So in Askeron in 1988, March, I believe, or February, there were attacks in Azerbaijani villages. There were attacks in the Azerbaijani villages in Gafan. Now, later in 1991, 92, 93, 94, there's a lot of Armenian atrocities. Ojali genocide. I think we all agree that that's a bloodshed, and I think it's such atrocity. And talking about the human suffering side, now let's look at it. 600, 700,000 people were forced out of their homes, and Armenia didn't let them come back. That's a human suffering. For 30 years, people had to wait. So many people died without seeing their homes, without seeing their lands. And when we talk about sufferings, I think we should understand that we can't only think about 1918 or 1915 or in one specific event. We need to look at it and say, well, 600, 700,000 people have been suffering for 30 years. And in the case of demographics, we can look at the existential threat. I don't think during Soviet times there was any existential threat from Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan, if Armenian side in 1987, which is before even there's any Soviet collapse, right? So Armenians started claiming that we should reunify, bring the Nagorno-Karabakh back to Armenia. I don't think that would essentially, it's based on existential threat. It was just a dream of, or I think the demands of Armenian side that no matter what happens, we can have some pretext on this, but no matter what happens, we should take this land from Azerbaijan. They didn't even give a chance to Azerbaijan to be independent and actually have these two communities to live together in peace under the Azerbaijan rule. And in fact, the peace negotiations never said that this area is going to be independent or anything like that. It was always under Azerbaijani rule. And I think Armenian side may push, we can't exist together, but I think all sides deserve a chance to be given to exist together, which was not given in 1987, 88, and 89. Now, speaking of the President Erdogan and Turkey's involvement, well, Turkey is a member of Minsk Group, so may not be co-chair, but you're a member of the committee that has 3 co-chairs. 3 co-chairs are responsible to essentially make the proposals, and the members have some responsibility there too. And during these years, decades, if Armenia was very close with Russia and in terms of in terms of receiving military weapons and all the equipment, I think it's not very surprising that, and shouldn't be very surprising, that Azerbaijan also had to build up some military capacity. That was the reason. If in 1991, 1992, 1993, Azerbaijan had a military capacity to withstand Armenia, I don't think all these atrocities would happen. Now, obviously, yes, all revenues flow. All revenues help Azerbaijan to build its military arsenal. But Azerbaijan was part of negotiations since 1993. Mr. Ilham Aliyev was part of negotiations in 2003, 2004, 5, 6, 7. In 2006 and 2007, Madrid Principles were signed. He was part of that. Mr. Erdogan, he was part of the initiatives to open the borders protocol in 2009 with Armenia, right? He's the same person. He was willing, he put his reputation, political will, to open the borders with Armenia. I think at that time Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. So that was a statement of some goodwill, right? And no matter what I think Armenian side thinks, Mr. Ilham Aliyev, Mr. Heydar Aliyev, they have always been part of the peace negotiations. But as you said, the time is such that these negotiations cannot go forever. And when you see the rhetoric on the other side, where they say, you know what, these peace negotiations, things changed, time passed, and Mr. Pashinyan says we should revisit the forgotten Treaty of Severs, which actually makes claims to Turkey. We should mention that too. I think from Armenia's perspective, Armenia has a very long borders with Azerbaijan and Turkey. In this region, no matter what the back history, I mean, we can go back centuries and centuries. I can make arguments, you can make arguments. I think the point is that, does Armenia actually want to live in this region peacefully? And does Armenia give a chance to those internally displaced people come back? Which at the end of this war, we have that now. Now, Armenians can easily go back to Nagorno-Karabakh under Russian peacekeeping operations. They are back, right? Russian peacekeeping operations, they make reports, they say this many families came back. Can Azerbaijanis go back that easily? No. Why? Because Armenian forces have essentially mined most of the areas. And we see that there will be, at least officials say, 10 years. It will take 10 years to clean those, to demine all those territories. So even if Azerbaijan took its lands back, it can't easily go back. The internally displaced people, and that's like 600, 700,000 people, cannot go back that easily. So I think that we need to mention all these. And then France, I want to make a point about the France. When this war started, this second one, Mr. Emmanuel Macron said that we're not going to let Azerbaijan enter Nagorno-Karabakh. Mr. Macron and France is the co-chair of the Minsk Group. How come he can make this statement? After the war, he said, these are internationally recognized territories of Azerbaijan. Now, my point is that for these 30 years, the leaders of these co-chairs of leaders of these countries that are co-chairs of the Minsk Group have been sending mixed signals. If they were serious and put pressure on Armenia, saying that you need to vacate, at least you need to vacate these 7 districts based on the agreements that we both agreed. Especially, even Mr. Biden, in his statement recently during the election period, said Armenians cannot keep continuing to occupy those 7 districts around Nagorno-Karabakh. The problem is that we can use a lot of pretexts without giving any chance for Azerbaijanis and Armenians to live together peacefully, but not letting those 600 and 700 people to come back, to leave outside the Nagorno-Karabakh, tells me that Armenia was not really serious about the peace. And in 2020, 2019, and in the back, actually, some videos now, we see that Armenian side claimed that we fought, we won those territories, we're not going to give them back. Well, yes, but they were fighting on somebody else's land. During 44-day war, Azerbaijani army was very discreet at not entering the Armenian side, right? So basically, this after 5 days, or maybe a week, it was obvious that the militarily Azerbaijan's army was superior, as you just said. I would like to see Mr. Pashinyan and Armenian government to transparently communicate at that time. They should have communicated that, yes, we're losing, not what they said we're winning. Not to say that, oh, Azerbaijanis are under illusion. No, just to communicate the real facts from the ground and say, we are willing to go back to the peace discussions. And in fact, Mr. Aliyev, several times in the beginning of this second war, several times said, we're willing to go back to discuss. It's obvious that, well, we have a military power, but we don't want to go forward. We would like to go back to the peaceful negotiations, but it didn't happen. Armenian side didn't until it was such that late that Armenia had no other choice. And I think I want to also make one comment about Ramil Safarov. I think Ramil Safarov's. We can say a lot about his behavior, but we don't know his psychological situation in that training. And then he was harassed by Armenian soldier, I guess. And I don't believe that a lot of Azerbaijanis. Basically, the Armenian narrative is that, oh, a lot of Azerbaijanis would act like him. Let me tell you, a lot of Azerbaijanis who were internally displaced suffered those losses from those areas. They live all around the world. They live all around the world, but they never took any actions against Armenians. Nowhere. Everyone waited patiently for the peace negotiations to find its meaningful conclusion, but it didn't. How long would we drag this? And the danger was that, as we said, Armenian rhetoric was that, you know what?
Fariz, sorry to cut you. I want us to have a little bit more of a back and forth. We're already going on 48 minutes.
Okay. Well, I didn't know where we are with the time. Okay.
Yeah, I just sorry about that. I know Adar, you asked me to.
No, I'll go, Daniel. You're a co-moderator, real quick.
Sorry, I know.
Real quick. To whoever's just joining us, I just want to make this statement again. The comment section is the place to continue the respectful conversation that Fariz and Rich is having. Anybody engaging in personal attacks, group hate, any form of discrimination is going to be banned from the comments. I'm not giving any warnings. Learn from our guests, Fariz and Rich, how to have a respectful conversation. Take that and bring it to the comment section. Bring it to your homes. Bring it to your families. This is what we're here to do. We're not here to hate on one another, and it won't be tolerated in the comment section. See you soon.
All right, so we have to definitely keep some of the back and forth a little bit more concise for the sake of time. And Rich, I know Fariz just went on a long end on his segment on his end, so I know it's only fair for you to be able to respond to that. So I just wanted to ask you something that I meant to ask you before, and hopefully you can respond to Fariz within that response and in a broader sense. So I just want to say, I think we have to break up certain things into their own groups. So there's the abstract, there's the abstract scholarly thing, what's the international law, who's right on this abstract sense, and then there's the on the ground genuine concerns and genuine trauma and genuine history that people are going through. So Rich was talking about the Armenian psyche and a sense of genuine fear, of existential fear. And, this is an Israel-Palestine channel in general. And just as someone who's Jewish, who had Holocaust survivor grandparents, and I believe the Jewish experience is very similar in that sense, in that there's a strong sense of distrust, and basically the exception is proving that there could be coexistence, and not assuming it, because there's a sense that we're constantly vulnerable and this sort of phenomenon. So with regards to the suffering of the war, there's a lot of collective trauma from when this went on in the late 80s until this point. And so, yes, there were 600,000 internally displaced Azerbaijanis from the broader Karabakh region, which expanded beyond the Nagorno-Karabakh into the 7 surrounding districts. But there was also a de facto near complete population exchange between the rest of Azerbaijan and Armenia, where 200,000 Azerbaijanis from Armenia proper were essentially deported to Azerbaijan, and then 300,000. This is another big factor of the suffering, which is also definitely needs to be mentioned. 300,000 Armenians essentially were fled Azerbaijan into Armenia based on a number of things like Sumgait and the coup pogroms and things like that. So that's also relevant context, and this goes back to perhaps something else I wanted to touch upon, which is the chicken versus egg situation. What came first? Because Fariz, you mentioned that Armenians didn't give Azerbaijan a chance to coexist as a post-Soviet entity where they could actually have communal rights. And what I will say is that while I understand the conflation with Turkey, as a pan-Turkic dynamic, I will say that as someone who's familiar with, let's say, the Jewish community of Azerbaijan, there I think there is a genuine complete integration and freedom of religion. They opened up Jewish synagogues, Jewish communities with government funding, and there's a complete coexistence between the community. There's also a more gray area perhaps with groups like the Talish, which have had, I think, historical perhaps some sort of peripheral secessionists and things like that, but nothing compared to the Armenian dynamic. And there's also more or less, I think, internal cultural freedom. To me, it seems that a lot of that. First of all, I will say that there's for sure animus from Azerbaijan towards Armenians and vice versa. But my question, I'm not completely sure if it's due to Armenians being, let's say, Turkic or non-Muslim or something like that. Azerbaijan is pretty much a secular country anyways on the ground, in reality. But it seems to me that the background of a lot of this hatred may be rooted in the Karabakh conflict in the first place, because meaning the other two groups I mentioned, which exist in Azerbaijan, I mean, not in significant numbers, but definitely minorities that have their rights. I think because they never engaged in that, blood deep conflict, and just basically submitted to the post, Azerbaijani autonomy and existed therein. I think that's a factor for why they were able to basically exist as such in a way the Armenian community was not. But at the end of the day, this did happen, and there definitely was not a complete oasis of peace or whatever, as that narrative may seem. There was definitely tensions going back decades within the Soviet Union. But to me, it seems without question that the secession and the conflict of that and the outcome of that is what really exacerbated a lot of this. So this sort of ties into the next session, which is what can be done to sort of show a good faith gesture of the ability of the Armenian community to coexist in Azerbaijan, because you can make the argument that had this not happened, they would have been able to, the way the Jewish community or the Talysh community, the Russian Orthodox community could. But the fact is this did transpire, and the fact that there is this animus that exists. And then just going back to the collective trauma, so I did mention, yeah, there was definitely war crimes on the Armenian side, like Khojaly massacre, and during the first Karabakh war. But in the second Karabakh war, we've seen, we've also seen a number of war crimes. I'm sure people who are watching are familiar with, high-profile, beheadings of an, elderly. Azerbaijani civilian villager, and there was, I also think it was the other side as well. I don't mean to both sides, because I don't think there's an equal power dynamic at play, meaning right now the Azerbaijani side is the hegemony. I believe the same was true for the Armenian side in the late 80s, early 90s, but now the situation has flipped. So I think there's an imperative need for the hegemonic power to really be the one showing tolerance. But there definitely was also war crimes again. I mean, there was definitely also war crimes and atrocities against Azerbaijanis in this past war, even if they were, let's say, the stronger party that was, launching the military. Azerbaijanis will say liberation, Armenians will say attack. But there was, for example, an Armenian Azerbaijani border guard after the peace deal, who was kidnapped and had his throat slit as well. And there was an Azerbaijani civil ambulance driver who accidentally passed the armistice line and was essentially lynched. But there was definitely also Azerbaijani crimes. You've seen, videos of desecration of private homes, knocking down tombstones and posing in it, and I believe 2 high-profile beheadings and things like that. So there is this trauma and this unresolved trauma, and there is, I believe, a genuine reason and rooted rationale for why there's a trust. And now the distrust should I think be focused on the Armenian side, because again, there's a power dynamic at play. And even if you can make the argument, who is the historical, one who did the other wrong historically, right now, there's a reality that there has to be a need for proving a goodwill of coexistence. And there's all these unresolved war crimes, and going back to the late 80s, and you mentioned Afterov. So I think there was that's even though that's one specific case, I do think that's like a sort of paradigm case in the Armenian psyche of like the Azerbaijani. It's sort of a microcosm of what they perceive as the Azerbaijani, sentiment and capabilities of what they may do towards Armenians. And then it has to be mentioned that there was
Daniel, sorry to cut you off. I do want to give it back to Rich.
Sure. All right, Rich. So if you could
Fariz had his time. Rich didn't get a chance to respond. We're already going on an hour, so sorry to cut you, but Rich, feel free. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. I mean, it's a complex issue in itself, and it's much more than the time we have for today, of course. And this is just the beginning of the discussions and the dialogue. There's very good points that we had here. It's Ramil Safarov is one that we mentioned here. In the Armenian psyche, like you mentioned, Ramil Safarov's case is the turning point in the 2000s in terms of rhetoric, because at the end of the day, leadership rhetoric still sends a message to your government. Whether it sends it internationally, domestically, it may be different. But on a domestic level, the Armenians saw this as a turning point. And I'm just explaining how the turn of events have been happening, right? How people are thinking about this, what the geopolitical factors are changing. So when we hear about Ramil Safarov, I think the axe murdering, of course, there is much more context to this, of course, maybe from where he is, whatever it is, but that's not to justify the axing of a lieutenant Armenian at a NATO Partnership for Peace program. And this action in itself could have been condemned, but instead it was appreciated with an extradite, back to Azerbaijan from Hungary, and given a raise and further elaborate on his success in from Ilham Aliyev's perspective. And I think this case is very dangerous, given that now we are noticing many gruesome videos. And this is not even to be debated for. It's just that's what's happening right now, given that emotions are very high, a lot of traumatic experiences, which is mental health at the end of the day. And that sheer idea of getting rewarded when you're brought back to a country and further given a raise of some sorts, that is the danger in this case, that further establishes the Armenian predetermined idea of existential threat that they experienced during the pogroms. Now, we talked about the Armenian political theory based on the Armenian genocide. And given that the understanding of Azerbaijanis seen from a more Turkish identity from Armenians that developed towards the end of the Soviet Union, I would say. This is, like I mentioned, my focus is the geopolitics of this. Why was Karabakh and Lachin, aka Berdzor area, why were those areas of interest? Well, it's the security buffer zone. It goes back to the insecurities that the Armenians have as a state. I think, something that the Assyrians, unfortunately, and the Kurds cannot say is that they have statehood. The Armenians, in contrast to them, who have also experienced their own traumas of the 20th century that never got acknowledged or any kind of official level from the direct oppressor in this case. That is very important as well. So it goes down to whether you feel this way or not. That's not necessarily, that's a separate issue. The issue here is the fact that the Armenians have this existential threat that they believe is there, and Azerbaijanis see this as a territory concept. The Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh did not feel safe enough to live under Azerbaijani rule. This is seen with the abolishment of the autonomy of Nagorno-Karabakh shortly before going into the 1992 war. This issue, or I should say the level of resolution we could have had, I think there was a window that was strongly missed. The window was within the 1990s, early 2000s that could have been developed. I think this is somewhere that I would agree that Armenian negotiations and Azerbaijan negotiations both had a fault in this place. The fault here is the lack of actual time frame of what it was going to look like, and it further exacerbated the issue. That is true. But also here is the fact that in the first ceasefire, we had the representatives of Nagorno-Karabakh, which we cannot dismiss in this case, given that Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, based off the law on secession of 1990, they found that within the 3rd, 4th, and 5th articles of that, they saw that autonomous oblasts do have the opportunity to claim their right to sovereignty as a predominant ethnic group in a certain autonomous oblast within Azerbaijan. Now, 2020 is higher levels of nationalism, and when I mean nationalism, it's not from the Western perspective of what it looks like. It's survival mode more so, and I would say it's even severely tied with patriotism. But in this case, it has the common identity that there is an existential threat, similar to how Azerbaijanis from 1994 all the way to 2020 had this idea that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, it needs to be resolved. Everyone can get behind that. On the Armenian side, it was not so clear in that sense, given that after the 1994 war, they had won, and it was treated like a win. In Azerbaijan, I think during that time, Azerbaijan and Armenia had the highest level of potential a pathway towards normalizing relationships, even though we can agree that normalization of relationship at this point is not possible within 5 to 10 years. Even the mining process takes more than it is the traumatic experiences, the return, understanding that Karabakh in itself is a very mountainous area. You have to go through the Omar Pass, and it's not easy to resettle there. So what can happen moving forward, like you mentioned, what needs to be done to build a unified narrative? Well, it's difficult when you have a loose policy like the current one we have, a trilateral agreement. And, you know, the sheer fact is that the trilateral agreement, I feel like expectations were set based off of the contributors. I think Turkey was looking to be a part of the agreement, but it did not show up. Instead, it just got a ceasefire control center in Aghdam. And you see that Russia, in this case, also seeks to exclude the Western world, while the Armenians would much rather have the OSCE Minsk Group framework within still moving forward. Given that you do bring France and the United States in this case. The Armenian diaspora is very important in this, given that the United States and France, there's much more of a Western perspective here, which is another issue for another day. But if we were to just simply talk about the geopolitical aspects of, you know, what needs to be for a unified narrative, I think there needs to be concrete studies on the rhetoric that we have seen from the Azerbaijani and Armenian side, as well as the policies implemented. Because one thing that we really see that angered the Azerbaijani side was the investment of Artsakh, aka Nagorno-Karabakh, you know, which includes the Armenian-controlled territory from 1994 to 2020, and later that changed on the trilateral agreement, and which is a very fluid concept in itself. Every day the map changes. If you guys want to just go on the Russian Ministry of Defense, the map changes every day. So this clearly is not a long-lasting, long-run goal. Although one thing that the Armenians would argue is that the Russian peacekeepers is a good sign towards security, right? But it still does not embody the full aspects of it, given that the military progression that Azerbaijan experienced in 2020, which it has been mentioning and has been militarizing since 2003, 2004, they have been mentioning these. But, you know, at the end of the day, Azerbaijan was a much stronger, powerful force in this. And there's a very great source on this. It's called the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where 4 members come and they talk about the disadvantages and the advantages of this war, both from Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, again, very important that this agreement is fluid and it's not a long-lasting answer to these. So I think it's very important for us to include the traumatic experiences and for there to be further research as part of the communications by the governments. Because we can talk about Khojaly, we can talk about the pogroms. Those are traumatic experiences that we can both agree on in terms of the both sides bringing it to the table. Because personally, Khojaly, there's still various sources on, you know, whether it happened or it didn't happen, but I like to look at it from the perspective of that there's this trauma within the Azerbaijan community of the massacre did occur. However, whether who did what, at that point, I personally believe that that is not a constructive way to move forward and see this issue. The fact remains that both sides here have a trauma of some sorts from the 90s and the 80s as well. And now there's new traumas being experienced, given that there's beheadings going around and these different videos, as media is completely a new factor into this in contrast to the 90s as well. So I think moving forward, there needs to be a independent research specifically for this, where you have Armenian and Azerbaijani researchers mentioning these, looking into these, because it's very important. Because right now, what I am currently looking at this from, I'm looking at it from afar and saying, okay, we have the Armenians that have this existential threat, and they believe they have that, and rightfully so. The same way Azerbaijani refugees that left from the areas of Karvajar, Kelbajar, or Lachin Berzor, they have this trauma as well. And that is not to justify further actions that comes after that in terms of any gruesome activity, but we need to acknowledge that these are parts of the conflict that we need to address much more on an official level, meaning on a government level, because me and Fariz can talk respectfully all day about this stuff. But at the end of the day, the government's rhetoric and the government's moves are much more important. So when we see a beheading of some sorts, we need to see condemnation. We need to see some sign from a government official where they show that this is not the right way moving forward. But as of right now, the rhetoric from the Armenians, from the Azerbaijani side, when an Armenian is looking at it, they see Ilham Aliyev call us dogs. We've seen Ilham Aliyev use very hostile rhetoric towards us, and that may be working benefit to his authoritarian power, given that he does run a very tight business in there, given that Azerbaijan is a newer state, and Armenia is a new state as well. So we need to understand that these traumas also should be mentioned in our discussions, given that both Armenia and Azerbaijan could admit that there's traumas here. Armenians will say there's an existential threat here. Azerbaijanis will say territorial integrity. However, some issues, similar to how Vladimir Putin says, is much more complex than international law. And this is where unique scenarios like the Caucasus come out. They erupt, similar to Crimea, it erupts, South Ossetia, Abkhazia. These are all scenarios that we cannot necessarily only look at from an international law lens. And that's also to say that I'm a geopolitical analyst. I'm not a expert in international law, and I'll be the first to say it. However, it is imperative to note that this issue is much more complex than simple geographic borders set by a Soviet Union or initiated by a Soviet Union that no longer exists. So, in the pathway towards a unified narrative needs to include independent research in these topics, included a part of the official governments, have some sort of communication dialogue. Maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be super official, meaning it doesn't necessarily have to be a direct diplomat, connected to this, but there needs to be more open source research and much more facts set in a database where we can agree that the governments can both access and utilize. But at this point, there's a disconnect on that, and I think it's very important. And given that now the geopolitical situation has significantly changed, meaning that we talked about how Russia has kept the West out of this by including Turkey. They'd much rather have Turkey in these communications much more than the Western world. That's just the Russian foreign policy. That's just how Vladimir Putin operates as a Joe Biden arrives to to his place. Now, Iran in this case is very important as well, which Fariz, I have many questions about this aspect, given now that Nakhchivan, the main seller, I don't think Iran is going to be the energy. So there's very, very important aspects to this as well, given that Iran will on paper show that it's supporting Azerbaijan. However, that may not necessarily reciprocate in real life. Georgia may be on, it closes its borders this time in contrast to the 90s where made much less active role. So when we look at this issue, we can't look at this anymore as a peer-to-peer conflict with Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now there's new factors in this. There's Israel a part of this conversation with its bone to pick with the Iranians. We have Turkey that's much more engaged in this region as it looks for energy security. As we know, Russia and Turkey, in terms of their energy deals, have decreased, and now Turkey looks to Azerbaijan at a much more comfortable level. It's no longer just political and moral support. Now you're actually seeing military exercises conducted from the 2010s, which means Turkey and Azerbaijan are looking to close that tie up. And now they're not looking to no longer rely on Georgia necessarily. They're also looking for a much faster route, much more applicable one through Nakhchivan, through the Mehri corridor. What's important about this as a result of the trilateral agreement is the silver lining that may come from the economic highway. However, that's not to say that once you set the economic highway, things go back to normal. This isn't the West where you can tie the European Union all together. No, these are very, very ethnically, I should say, identifying areas, meaning that they strongly believe in what they believe, and nationalism may be a part of that. But the economic highways need to have a specific understanding of what this is for. If, Nakhchivan to Azerbaijan, yes, of course, I understand. And then you also have another economic highway going through Sunik, which is essentially another form of tying Armenia and Azerbaijan's economic relationships, essentially, to rely on each other. Because at the end of the day, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now is what I'm thinking, there has to be a way where the two sides can understand this. But that is not to negate the fact that there is gruesome social levels right now that needs to be, gruesome social activities that needs to be addressed, both whether it's mental health, whether it's whatever. But it's very important to identify these as part of the conflict, given that when we talk about the conflict, the average Azerbaijani, the average Armenian will go back to the pogroms and they'll talk about the massacre, and then it'll just turn into whataboutism. And in order to move on from that whataboutism, we need to include these as part of the conversation. And, my perspective, geopolitically, this entire situation made sense. However, it's now being exacerbated with regional powers being much more involved with this. So I'm interested to see what's going to happen after January with Iran and Azerbaijan's tensions may escalate. Well, I'm unsure about that right now, and I can't predict the future, unfortunately. But I will say that this seems like it's moving towards a regional issue. And the one thing we need currently moving forward, the first step is some sort of diplomatic outreach from the Azerbaijanis, something that maybe in the 90s was lost in translation, but the ball's in Azerbaijan's court at this point. And we would like to see that positive communication now after the war, given that, the silver lining to this can be that we can move forward from this. But as of right now, the rhetoric, we are not comfortable with that from the Armenian side, at least, if I was to say we as an Armenians. But I do not represent the Armenians entirely. I'm just looking at this from okay, where can we go with this in 30 years, 40 years from now? Because again, like I mentioned, this is not going to be solved in 5 years with an agreement that is as fluid as changing every single day. Sorry, I'm mute, Daniel.
Can I interject and make a few points?
For sure. You could interject within because the response is going to anyways tie into what Rich was just saying. So what I wanted to do for the second to last segment was basically ask what can be done from each respective side to basically ensure that there's a goodwill and willingness to reconcile all the traumas, war crimes, etc., and ensure the security of coexistence with the other population. So the thing is, Rich, anyways, in Rich's segment, he anyways, I believe, went into that as it is because he was talking about things the Azerbaijani side needs to do. So I wanted to ask you things that you believe Azerbaijan can do, and let's say that the Armenian state or within representing the Armenian side within this conflict can do, as well as let's say the Armenian community within the Russian peacekeeping side of the Armenian side, because you're talking about the return of internally displaced people. So obviously they could do that now in the 7 districts and in Shusha, which they just took control over. But there's also there were a few Azerbaijani villages even in the Armenian supermajority part of mountainous Karabakh, known as Nagorno-Karabakh. So there's also a need for reconciliation there, and then there's reconciliation of all the war crimes, all the pogroms, Khojali, all these recent war crimes, and there's been a little bit of talk of investigation, but there's, in my opinion, rightful skepticism that this will actually be prosecuted. And every time you pinpoint a specific war crime, you say, oh, why is he pardoned? Why isn't he put in prison? And then all the other side will just say, yeah, because they did this. You're going to point out the beheading of the Armenian villager, and they're going to say, oh, what about the ambulance driver? Did anyone arrest them? And it's just a tit for tat, and no side is going to unilaterally go and prosecute their own as long as they can point to the other side as not doing it. So I think this is where international intervention and committees and things like that might be needed for a post-war reconciliation, similar to things we've seen in the Balkans. And so these are just things for like what can be done to move forward and show reconciliation over these things and ensure the protection of the other in terms of the community. So Fariz, I think that ties into things Rich was saying. I think Rich touched upon that in his segment. So if you could just get to that.
Thank you. And I just want to go off a few comments that Rich made and then tie to his later comments. I think when speaking of Ramil Safarov and his status and his essentially treatment by Azerbaijani people or government, I want to give 2 examples. It's not whataboutism. It is an example that comes from Serge Sargsyan, who was the president of Armenia. He represented Armenia as a president. So you don't go beyond that, right? He said, before Khojaly, the Azerbaijanis thought that they were joking with us. They thought that the Armenians were people who couldn't raise their hand against the civilian population. We were able to break that. And then goes on and saying that when a shell is flying through the air, it does not distinguish between a civilian resident or soldier. It doesn't have eyes. If the civilian population stays there, even though there was a perfect opportunity to leave, that means that they also are taking part in military operations. This is the president of Armenia saying this. Second, Mr. Pashinyan was elected the president by Armenian people through uprising, right? In 2018, in social unrest, and people said, we want Mr. Pashinyan to represent us. His rhetoric was not even friendly. His rhetoric was even more radical. So I think if we're going to talk about existential threat, think about an Azerbaijani living in Jabrail, Azerbaijani who lived in Lachin, who lived in Kalbajar. What would they think? What would they think now when Armenian president justifies Khojaly genocide, Khojaly massacre? How do we, Armenians like to talk, I mean, as Rich said, and I don't, essentially, it's okay, it's his right or their right to talk about going back to the 1915s or others, but the problem is that it's very recent. I have friends who still remember those atrocities, and they say, well, if I go back, will that happen again?
And that's why it should be a part of the, OSCE communications. It should be, and, I think that's what I was aiming at. Serge Sargsyan may have said it, but was that really a part of a grander picture of, are we looking into these scenarios? Because war crimes, it's part of war crimes, really. But in 2020, we experienced the phosphorus.
Let me say that, yes. So going forward, we need transitional justice. It's a name, but what it basically means that, yes, we need to investigate all the war crimes. We need to investigate all the war crimes going back to 1987 and since that. And can we do it internationally? I guess with international cooperation under certain committee could be formed, as I think Turkey suggested in 2009, that there's a scholarly committee should be formed, that Turkish and Armenians could come together and investigate all the things. But I think we need that, but we can't just say that Azerbaijani rhetoric based on Ramil Safarov, that's what it is, without mentioning what rhetoric Azerbaijan is. Not only rhetoric, what they've seen on the ground in 1991, 92, 93, 94. This is not a 1 month war. It took for 3-4 years, and people still live through those traumas. So I think there's an existential threat for Azerbaijan as well. It's not people who live there who guarantees them that Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh will not down the road claim that we want now again to unify with Armenia. Now we're going to use some tools, weapons, or whatever means, and we'll attack people around us and not let them come back for 30 years. So I think we can't just say there's an existential threat for a small group of people while the war caused such a large population of Azerbaijan leave their house, forced them to leave their house. But as Daniel mentioned, in Azerbaijan there are a lot of ethnic groups. They lived for centuries. They still live. They are in different religion. Maybe they're in different ethnic groups, Lesbians, Talush, and some others, and the Jewish people and Christians, Russian. We coexisted. Azerbaijan, I think, is a very unique, and I'm lucky, very lucky, to bring all these different cultures together. And we, I think, can make that happen under independent Azerbaijan Republic, that Armenians can live that. Since war, President Aliyev and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, they've been called.
2020 or 1994? Which war? I'm sorry.
Well, now now my point will be 2020, that since the war ended, and even during the war, and the war ended, President Aliyev and Azerbaijan side made several times requested or proposed that we're ready to go back to peace. We're ready to go back to peace if you're ready. But Mr. Pashinyan was not. He didn't agree to stop the war, essentially. He didn't agree to go back to the peace negotiations. Mr. Kocharyan, former president, said that within 5 days it was obvious what the result will be. And Pashinyan had to stop there. Didn't. later Russia's involvement resulted in that stop of bloodshed. Yes, and I think taking the given the three regions back to Azerbaijan that should have happened without war is very good. So we didn't have to go through war there in Kalbajar, Laçın, and Ağdam. But the idea is that saying that the Western powers were left out, forced out, no, they left themselves out. As you know, in 2001, there was a Key West negotiations, or US-led, and then there was a French-led negotiations. Then we have 2006 agreement, Madrid principles. Then they say, well, now ball is in the Russia's field. 2011 Kazan meetings, right? Medvedev tried to achieve something. Didn't work out. So I think that, and then gradually Western countries either lost their interest or said, well, in my mind, well, in the long run, probably Azerbaijan will not be strong enough to fight back, and then we don't want to impose a lot of pressure on Armenia to give up because there's an agreement and these 7 districts should come back, but they're not. So I think now going forward, but let me come back to the going forward. Yes, transitional justice on both sides, maybe not separately, it should be together. It's through some international committees. And we need to understand that Armenia, what is Armenia's commitment? Is Armenia committed to preserving or respecting Azerbaijan's territorial integrity or not? That's a big question. Like you mentioned, Iran, Azerbaijan respects Iran's territorial integrity. And and actually good that the border that between Azerbaijan and Iran, part of that where there was the invaded was not under Azerbaijani essentially authority. So now we restored that. That's very important between the countries. The borders, all the borders, it could be monitored. And there's I think we need to understand right now in Armenia situation is such that we don't know who's going to be in the long run. If we don't even know what's going to happen in 2021 with Mr. Pashinyan will stay or not. So that doesn't give too much hope to Azerbaijani side that like you talked about signals from Azerbaijan. Well, both at the presidential level and at the Minister of Foreign Affairs level, there are calls that we are willing to work and incorporate Armenians into socio-economic space of Azerbaijan. Mr. Erdogan said we can have a platform of 6 countries, economic platform of 6 countries. Now, I don't claim that economic cooperation will solve everything. No, but that's a start. Where do you start? Either cultural integration, either political integration, or either economic, right? So no start. That Armenia has to fully commit to the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. That's must happen. There's no other way. But then economic relationship, if you look at that, we have Turkey, Iran, and Russia have economic agreement. We have Turkey, Georgia, and Azerbaijan have economic agreement. We have Russia, Iran, and Azerbaijan economic agreement. One country is missing, Armenia. Armenia could join, and I guess it would be easy to put all these together, which was suggested by Azerbaijani government, 6-sided economic platform. Why? Because you need to build these relationships between different economic entities. And I think it's very important for Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding areas to be able to do that. Because I don't see those areas development without integrating with Azerbaijan and with Armenia down the road. But we need to know what's going to happen. Which one is going to prevail in Armenia? Peaceful narrative, or let's wait, we have time for 5 years, and then we'll come back and get back at them. That narrative. Or Mr. Pashinyan didn't fight the war really well. We're going to bring a new commander-in-chief who's going to fight the war again. We need to understand that what we want for the region and how Armenia sees itself in the region. And as I said, I want to go back to that existential threat. That's in the grounds for Azerbaijanis who are willing to go back and live in Jabrail, Gubatlı, and in Khojalı. Things are fluid. I understand. I think Russia has some goodwill here and is trying to. Peacekeeping operations are must. Now, research shows that in order to conflict not to flare up, 2 major elements are significant. 1, peacekeeping operations. to economic cooperation. So we needed peacekeeping operations, and I think Western governments were also were okay with Russian peacekeeping operations. We need to make sure that the Azerbaijanis are able to come back to the Nagorno-Karabakh area so that they can start practicing coexistence there. And obviously the surrounding 7 districts as well. And we need to start developing the area. Azerbaijan started some projects and bringing in foreign investors. With economic ties, that's the second element. Economic growth is the major significant factor that reduces the likelihood of future conflict. So that's why we need to invest in economic. I know it's not going to solve a lot of things, but the economic factors seem to be, according to research, is very, very significant. And the corridor through Megri is important because it gives a chance for this area that's landlocked to get out of there and maybe build up some exporting capacity. And also, Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan should be connected, right? As it was in Soviet Union, and it's not fair to not able to Azerbaijan to directly have a direct access to Nakhchivan. And if it brings a lot of economic relationship with Turkey, that's good. So I think going forward, yes. I mean, I just want to finish up that I think going forward, as you said, we need to understand what the Armenia's preference or what the Armenia's is essentially commitments are. What is Armenia committed to, and whether it's essentially building relationships or not.
I think thank you that Fariz. The Armenian scenario here is very unique, and you mentioned the 6 country integration of a group. I think it's and it's. This always goes.
By the way, Richard, just to quickly interject, you could definitely finish up this segment, but just for the sake of time, after you finish this, instead of going like back and forth, we're gonna hopefully go to closing remarks. If Fariz wants to respond to what you're saying in his closing remarks, then that's for sure good. And then we're gonna go to Fariz's closing remarks, and then to your closing remarks, and then we're gonna end it at there, and then go to the Discord after chat. So yeah, sorry about that, but just I had to go. Yeah, continue for Rich. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, moving forward, personally, from my experience, I strongly believe that the 6-party system may not operate as we think. The reason why I say this is, again, the precondition of the Armenian-Turkish relationship. I can't imagine this world where, Germany and Israel would be in the same chat if it was not, if the talk about the genocide was not there. It's unfortunate that we even have to talk about the genocide of 1915 in today's context, or even in the experience of any Armenian. However, that is a point that we have to not negate. It is. It's not necessarily whether should I not include this. It's just a matter of the fact of how the Armenians believe that this is an existential threat on their end. One of the main reasons why the Russians are guarding the west side of Armenia, while still patrolling Syunik, now that there's more belief in the Nakhchivan region that could possibly lead to further. And this is not to say that more military activity by the Russians in the Syunik is a potential threat in the future for the Nakhchivan people or for Azerbaijan in itself. It's simply the existential threat is there for the Armenian side. And in regards to where we can move forward from here, it's very, very important for the Armenia-Azerbaijani sides to have an understanding of what it's looking like moving forward, given that the Armenian domestic political affairs, which I won't talk too much about, but it is currently going through its own issues as well, similar to how maybe Azerbaijan in 1915, 1916 was going through rebuild mode of after the in post-war phase. So when we look at this, we have to understand that, okay, this is a new beginning at this time, 2020. There's more interest here. Personally, what I believe is going to happen is Russia's just going to use the least amount of force by implementing its case here, similar to how Vladimir Putin's foreign policy operates. It's using the least force and finding the highest level of effectiveness. Now, I personally think that at the end of the day, Russia is going to maintain its position there, similar to how I can't imagine Russia pulling out of South Ossetia, Russia pulling out of Abkhazia. And, you know, that's just the simple fact of it. And where we move forward from here, I could imagine Russia being a vital piece brokering these deals, but I cannot imagine Turkey having an avid role in this. But then again, that's just how I feel right now. Personally, I think that Russia and Turkey will at some point come back to this and make this their own regional issue without the French and Americans. But the Russians may use the OSCE framework, given that they haven't dismissed that fact that the OSCE still stands, and come back to the OSCE whenever they so choose. We cannot negate the fact that, you know, who's next in line for Russia? These are all questions that I want the people listening here to, you know, kind of get thinking as well. Because when we think about this issue, sometimes we get stuck between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But as I mentioned, this is becoming a regional issue where Iran is also involved. You had Turkmenistan providing airspace allegedly for Armenia to access, you know, military goods to Armenia through Iran. So there's numerous factors in the region, and given that the Caspian Sea is a very underdeveloped topic as well to talk about, Turkey's looks to the Caspian Sea. So we have to have a realistic understanding of what that normalization period looks like. And that comes down to security of the people to feel good about living amongst each other again. Because one thing that we mentioned is that during the Soviet Union, there may have been issues on a very small scale level from the 1930s all the way to the 1980s, but the fact remains that they lived relatively peacefully, living under the same umbrella of the Soviet Union. The variables back then didn't include or didn't allow national pride, or else you're sent to Siberia. So you know, we need to understand what were the variables that allowed us to live, you know, amongst each other back then, and we have to understand that now. Whether it's 30 or 40, 50 years from now, as I keep on saying, don't mean to sound like a broken record, but it's the truth at some point. And given my expertise with the geopolitics of it, I understand that this issue is transforming. It's going into a separate direction. So the least the Armenian and Azerbaijani official governments can do is show a gesture towards getting back to it. One thing that won't allow this, most likely in the immediate sense, is given the experiences that we're experiencing right now. And that's why I say it needs to all be collectively researched as part of the war crimes during the war and as well as post-war, because these issues are not going to stop, unfortunately, and I'm going to knock on wood after this. But unfortunately, these issues may come up again in the post-war phase. How are we going to tackle these issues? Is Azerbaijan going to have a special scenario to this in their legal system? Is Armenia going to have a legal system? Because understanding that the economic highways, there needs to be a plan for action that follows as well. Given that the movement of people is inevitable at some point based off the trilateral agreement, if it upholds, right? Given that we both understand that it's very fluid, I'd hope to see some progress in terms of where both can see a compromise or just see where this can take. However, I do believe that the official government level of just simple rhetoric needs to change. And one thing that you mentioned, Farizjan, about the Pashinyan administration, we had Kochayan and Ser Sargsyan, that the Sargsyan and the Kochayan regime were much more strong in their security position. They were much more consistent with it as well. Pashinyan was a populist choice by the democratically elected, we can say. The people believe that one of the main issues for them was anti-corruption, but they didn't take into perspective the security issues as well. Personally, Pashinyan's foreign policy didn't resonate really well, in my opinion. I'll be the first to say that I'm not a fan of his foreign policy. However, domestically, he did change the culture. And when it comes to the comment of Karabakh as Armenia, I think that was very incorrect to say, given that Artsakh, aka Nagorno-Karabakh, in this context is its own right to self-determination, right? They are seeking that option, and Nikol Pashinyan essentially changed that course. And this is simply looking at it from a lens of, okay, what actions are pushing people to believe a certain way? And I think during that time where he was mentioning that in Nagorno-Karabakh, that's where we can understand that, the issue as well, that Armenians feel very close connected to Nagorno-Karabakh people, similar to how the Greeks and the Cypriots may have that, unconditional connection with each other. So oftentimes that's where I mentioned that this issue is much more complex than just international law. It needs to be seen as a case specific to regional studies in the Caucasus, given that it's a very underdeveloped topic. If you look for scholarship on this, I strongly suggest those who are young to get into the political sciences, given that the Caucasus definitely deserves much more research, much more independent outlooks on this issue. Given that in the future, I hope to see research centers that bring all perspectives into this. And of course, that's without the government weight. But on a sense, we do need to change the government rhetoric happening to it, whether it's Armenia towards Azerbaijan or Azerbaijan towards Armenia. Nonetheless, the fact remains that the dialogue between is very hostile, and it seems to not be changing anytime soon, which is unfortunate. But at least the trilateral agreement, under the circumstances, it may provide more insight on where we can go from here. And Daniel, you mentioned that we're closing up on time. We're an hour and 40 right now. Would you like me to just go into my closing remarks, or you're on mute, brother? I'm sorry.
You could do that, sure, and then Fariz will incorporate his response to you and his closing remarks as well. Sure, so go ahead, and like in your closing remarks, also a subset of that is what you would like to see, moving down the line. Not getting into narrative, just things you'd like to see moving.
Yes, things I would like to see is more dialogue. Me and Fariz here right now, it's a very uncomfortable position for many of our compatriots. For my side, Armenian. For his side, I can't speak for your Fariz, but I could imagine it's a difficult place to simply have dialogue. And it doesn't end here. We need to have much more discussions about this. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is that we're on a debate show. But really, this is more of listening to the other side, understanding the other side, because realistically speaking, our populations have not interacted since the Soviet Union, really. And lots has changed since then. Whether for the better or for the worse, that's an issue. That's a separate issue. But a lot has changed since then. And the least we can do as scholars, and for me, I'm a much younger scholar than you, Fariz, and it's very important for me to understand that many people out there are curious to know what the Azerbaijani side is feeling, what the Azerbaijani side is saying, and this is not to negate not to completely ignore the fact that Armenians may be feeling this way too, and that Azerbaijanis should be listening to the Armenians and seeing what their perspective is. That way we have more think tanks and whatnot to identify these issues and moving forward. Daniel, Adar, thank you so much for the platform. I think this is very important given the very delicate time we are in. One side is celebrating because they're coming back to a location they once were. One side is grieving right now, and the death toll is very high, unnecessarily high, I would say. And this issue could have been avoided, and I want more people to be discussing these issues, because the more we talk about it, you won't realize, but in 30 years from now, it'll be much clearer. Right now, it's difficult. It's like a Band-Aid taking it off, but we need to be engaging in these difficult dialogues in order for us to further understand from a much more operational standpoint of what that future process looks like, because we can be stuck in the history in order to understand things, but in order to move forward, we need to see action, and we need to see rhetoric that falls in line with it, and it needs to be consistent, that we can both agree that all sides need to maintain their consistency. Thank you for having me. Fariz, it was a pleasure talking to you. This is the first of its kind for me, so I appreciate you. Adar, I appreciate you as well. And my closing remarks is to keep engaging in dialogue, people.
Thank you so much, Rich. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Fariz, we'll give you final thoughts as well. If you could just please keep it to 3-4 minutes, just because we do want to get to the after party. Friends watching, the conversation is not over. We're going to move it to Discord. Discord is a chat platform that also has video calls, video and voice chats. I am dropping a link now. Once you join the Discord, you will see on the left side, it says lounge. If you click on the lounge, you'll be connected with voice and video if you choose. You'll also see on the left side a hashtag that says Armenia-Azerbaijan, where you can write in text. The conversation will continue. We will not tolerate any personal attacks or group hate. I'm telling you all now, it's been a great pleasure. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe. We're gonna do more Armenia-Azerbaijan debates because we see there's a need for it. It's an important topic, and there's a lot of passion here. This is only the beginning. Fariz, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that we need to start with small steps. And I saw that I want to give one example. When in Kalbajar, I believe Azerbaijani and Armenian soldiers, I think, and border security guard were participating in delimitation and demarcation of the border. I think the borders there had to be corrected, and they both came together and they did it. And both sides, an Armenian government and Azerbaijani government, in my understanding is that they were ready for that, and they this kind of a one example of how border issue, let's say, it's such a tension at the tension time right after the war, could be actually peacefully resolved. They just showed that. And I think in Agdam, where there were videos where Azerbaijani soldiers were helping Armenian villagers who lived there to move their stuff, I think, and they were offering them, you can stay here. I think Azerbaijani government's statement of goodwill needs to be met in a way that Azerbaijani government says we are willing to reach out to Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenian community of Nagorno-Karabakh, and beyond those peacekeeping operation line, and we would like to incorporate them to the socio-economic space of Azerbaijan. We need to on the Armenian side and the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, we need to stop the territorial claims. We need to stop this. I think the demands for some kind of independence or whatnot. We need to start building some community relations, maybe. So Azerbaijani local authorities should be able to reach out to Armenians living there, and Azerbaijanis should be able to come back. It won't be easy, as I said. Armenians could easily come back, but it won't be easy for Azerbaijanis. And at the same time, we want to see on the Armenian side, the government side, we need to see some security or guarantee or some kind of a commitment to stop the territorial claims against Azerbaijan. And at the same time, we want to see some sustainable leadership, where in this region, as you know, Rich, relationships between the leaders are very important. Relationships between leaders need to be formed. Relationship between governments need to be formed. Relationship between different groups of society need to be formed. But it can't be separate from each other. We need to make sure that maybe we can talk about 30 years from now, but I think right now on the ground, we want to make sure that Azerbaijan's government takes a big task to economically develop the areas that were devastated from the war, and make sure that there are some good level of living standards are provided to people who go back to those to occupy liberated lands now, and Azerbaijanis, and at the same time reach out to the Armenian community, not to the military, not to the military criminals who participated in the war, but some kind of community leaders, that Armenian leaders that are willing to participate in civil discussion with Azerbaijani government authorities, local authorities, and not think about any independence or other things. I think this needs to be dropped out completely. And I'm a little bit more maybe with my background, I'm a little bit more hopeful with the economic cooperation, because that's one of the cooperations that you could say people might be interested. When small businesses work together, maybe, or big businesses, they start building some relationships. And with the Turkey, I think Armenia needs to realize that Turkey is their neighbor, and building good relationships with Turkey is very important and beneficial for Armenia too. From the economic point of view, if you look at the Turkey's economic trade relationship with its neighbors, Armenia's relationship is so lagging, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. Now, it's not going to solve a lot of problems, but these relationships need to be built so that you have more, not forced but natural dialogues. Not like a moderator brings you and me together, hey, come, let's have this discussion, but a little more ties that are organically tied. The communities are tied to each other, businesses tied to each other, people are tied to each other. I think that's important. There's a room for that. Azerbaijani government, my understanding is willing. I think there's a little bit uncertainty on the Armenian side, as I said, because of the political future. It's really difficult to predict what's going to happen. But at the end of the day, it will be Armenia's nation to decide how they want Armenia, what role do they want for Armenia in this region. And it's quite natural that Azerbaijani government tried to build good relationship with Russia, with Turkey, with Georgia, and with Iran. I think that's a must because they're our neighbors. And I think why do we want a sixth platform? Because bilateral relationships are kind of silos. So that when you bring all these sides together, maybe that's where you can hear. And maybe there's some balances. Maybe some of the threats are minimized. And that's how we can probably be part of a bigger. You mentioned Soviet Union. Now that's not going to happen because it's politically, we're not going to go back to the Union. But economically, cooperation. We want cooperation as well. We want cooperation build up between these countries, as Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey showed that right after the first war. I think it's possible. It's a phased approach. It's the phased approach that has been since 90s. But at the same time, as you mentioned, we need to be more willing for coexistence. We need to be more willing to live peacefully. We need to be more willing to think about Armenians and Azerbaijanis of the region, not what diaspora overseas want, not what France or US or Russian government wants. It's more, or their disagreements. We don't want their disagreements to flow into the area. They might disagree about the Mediterranean Sea. They might disagree about the Northern Africa, but we shouldn't be victims of that. We shouldn't be held hostage of those the disagreements. I think this region deserves peace. I think it's possible. Oh, and we need to gain that by showing some efforts. And as you said, I think after First War, Armenia won the war, but did not actually display willingness to peace. I think now in Azerbaijan, there's a big responsibility. Show that is willingness to peace. And I think they're doing it. At the same time, make sure that the people on the ground who is going to live there, they have necessary basic conditions, living conditions, and their needs are satisfied. So maybe more governance issues and local governance, that's important. And more socioeconomic, as I said, to development projects. I think it's doable. It's going to take time. But I want to thank you. I want to thank Adar. I want to thank Daniel for making me part of this. Also, I'm scholarly involved in this. Recently started to be involved more in the economic side. So it's intellectual curiosity for me. But at the same time, I want my kids to see this region more peaceful, and all these countries getting along with each other. And people don't talk about existential threat, but they say, hey, how can we exist together more? And that's my wish.
Fariz, thank you so much. Fariz, Rich, Daniel, brothers, it was a great pleasure. As I've mentioned, this will be the first of many discussions on this conflict. So whoever's joining here for the first time, I hope you stick around. The after party will continue in the Discord. Let me drop that link one last time. I'm reminding you now, we're going to keep the conversation respectful. Discord is an opportunity for everybody else to express themselves and share your opinions. If you want to get in touch with our guests, you could find a link to their social media in the description, as well as mine. You'll see a link tree. You can see all my social media. Reach out to me if you want to ask me questions, if you want to recommend something. I'm always happy to engage. And that's it. With love from Tel Aviv, Israel. Signing out, my friends. Until next time.